Keith, I'm always impressed at your ability to wear a tie to these meetings. It's just a little too much for me at 7 o'clock.
Doesn't everyone wear a tie when they're at home?
No, just you.
Did not get that memo. I apologize. No. Corrective actions needed.
You just turn the video off and come back without the tie. Nobody will know. You have 1 minute. There he goes. He comes back with a tank top. I'll not be very happy about that.
Hello.
There we go. Perfect.
No tank top.
Didn't have to twist your arm too hard. Let's see. He's not here. We have 5, so that constitutes a quorum, correct? I didn't see if you nodded your head.
I believe that is correct.
Yeah, that is correct. We still are 2 members short. I'm working with the Commonwealth to try to get those positions appointed.
Yeah, Armand is not on, or at least I don't see him. So we can get going. Rhea, if you wanted to start the recording, just point at me or give me a nudge.
Randy, I'm going to start recording. Just give me a second. Thank you. I'm sorry, there's a situation here. We have exceeded the recording storage allocation for the WebEx site. So we may not be able to record the meeting, but we will still have it live streamed and archived on YouTube. So that should be a good reference point for us. With that, I think we should continue with what we have. Thank you, Chair Boyce.
Okay. So if we're streaming, I can go ahead. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending today's Technical Advisory Committee for the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority. I'm going to first introduce the agenda. We're going to go over the transaction vision and goals. Mr. Jasper is going to take us through a majority of that. But first, we have to do the resolution finding the need to conduct the meeting electronically. Therefore, as a result of the COVID-19 and Governor Northam's declaration of a state of emergency, the authority's Technical Advisory Committee meeting is being held electronically. With the recent passage of the amendments to HB 29, the Freedom of Information Act bill, which allows regional bodies such as the authority and their committees to conduct business meetings electronically. This evening's business meeting is being held remotely. Doing so will enable us to keep safety as a top priority while ensuring that we are adhering to social distancing requirements. Meeting by electronic means is authorized because of the items in the October 21st, 2020 committee meeting agenda are statutorily required or necessary to continue operations of the authority. Do I have a motion to accept this resolution?
Pat is here. I'll second the resolution.
Do we have a first?
I move to accept the resolution.
So, all right. Hey, Amron. Anybody opposed? Say no. Hearing none, that resolution is passed. There were summary notes of our last meeting, September 16th. Need a motion to approve or make comments on those notes. I had no comments myself.
Motion to approve.
A second, please.
Second.
Anybody opposed, say no. Hearing none, those are the meeting minutes from September 16th are approved. So we move on to Mr. Jasper with the transaction vision and goals.
Thank you, Chair Boyce and members of the Technical Advisory Committee. Thanks for coming out this evening. I have a short presentation to kick off the discussion. We did actually talk about vision and goals at the last meeting, but that was really just to kind of introduce the topic. So I just want to dive down a little bit more deeply, but most importantly, I want to get some feedback from the committee members this evening. So to start with, just to recap on definitions and kind of guidelines to your thinking on this. Tonight we're just focused on vision and goals. We will talk about objectives, performance measures, probably not weights, but we've showed them kind of grayed out on this slide to indicate, as the note at the bottom says, that objectives, measures and weights will not be finalised until the second half of calendar year 2021, and that will enable us to reach out and get citizen and stakeholder inputs before we ask this committee and other committees and the authority to take any further action. So there's information provided for context, but and there'll be some discussion as well on a few things related to measures. But in terms of the action item itself, that is focused on vision and goals. And as the definitions here show, I'm sure you're familiar with this from your respective walks of life. The vision statement is kind of like a very high level preferred or idealized state. And actually, can you go back one, please, Ria? And the goals begin to focus a little bit on the priorities and the outcomes that the authority wants the region to kind of move forward with. So keep in mind in all of this that the vision and goals really are owned by the authority, and we're looking to give them guidance and advice and recommendations. But at the end of the day, the decision as to whether or not to accept a particular set of vision and goals is going to be on the authority members when we're ready to take it to them. So kind of vision and goals, aspirational, high level, but the objectives really help us kind of get down into what we call performance-based planning. So we'll talk a bit more about that in just a moment. Next slide, please, Ria. So again, you've seen this before, and some of you were involved at the time as well. This is the kind of complete set: vision, goals, objectives, performance measures, and weights for the performance measures that were approved as part of a two-step process by the authority. They approved vision and goals first about 5 years ago, and we came back to them some months later to seek approval for objectives, performance measures, and weights, and particularly in the case of the objectives, performance measures, and weights, that went through a process of committee reviews. And as I said earlier, we will repeat that, but we're not ready to do that yet. So the vision is the two sentences to the left of this slide, and I'd really ask you to focus on the first part of that, the first paragraph. In the 21st century, Northern Virginia will develop and sustain a multimodal transportation system that enhances quality of life and supports economic growth. That was a slight tweak on what preceded it, but in essence, that sentiment has been carried from each transaction update to the next, with only relatively minor changes, if any at all. And it is the starting point. If we don't make any recommendation to the authority, then almost by default, this set of vision and goals, and potentially the objectives and measures as well, would kind of become the vision and goals for the next update for transaction. But since we only do this on a 1 in 5 year basis, we believe it's highly appropriate and indeed necessary to review this at the beginning of each cycle, and that's really where we are. So that is provided for kind of contextual background. We can come back to this during the course of the meeting if that's helpful. Next slide, please, Ria. So here are some 3 proposed new elements that we want to incorporate at this kind of high-level aspirational kind of stage, and if these new elements do actually find their way into what the authority approves for, certainly for the vision and potentially the goals, then it will have fairly significant ramifications for how we think about objectives and measures subsequently. So I just want to touch on each of these 3 now. The equity being the first one, we give here kind of a sense as to what we mean by equity, which is really drawn upon what other parts of the region and the country kind of think about when they look at equity in transportation. So there's this sense of fairness in mobility and accessibility, which could be at the regional level, more likely at the sub-regional or community level, or even more finely grained than that, depending on what particular aspect of equity we try to address. And then the second part of that is to really facilitate the social and economic opportunities, and which kind of speaks to affordability and reliability of transportation options that serve the needs of all, but particularly focusing on underserved populations, people with disabilities or less abled or differently abled folks across the region. So that kind of broadly is kind of setting the context for equity. And I would say after we had the Technical Advisory Committee meeting last month, we did have the same conversation we had with you, with both our PCAC, the Planning Coordination Advisory Committee, which is comprised of 1 elected official from each of the 5 counties, 4 counties, 5 cities and 5 towns across the region, and also with the Planning and Programming Committee, which is comprised of 5 authority members. But actually at that PPC meeting, 2 other authority members did participate. And what we heard from both of those committees quite resoundingly is that there's a clear directive that transaction must consider equity in this next update. It wasn't really even an option. It was more of a direction that was given. Now, there was no direction given as to how we should go about doing that or any measures we should look at, but the general sense at the aspirational level that we need to do something. Historically, we haven't overtly done a whole lot when it comes to equity, although when you look at some of the previous measures, you could certainly make a case that some of them have an equity component to them. I'm not going to make that case right now. The second proposed new element is sustainability. And, just a couple of ways to look at sustainability, which are fairly widely accepted, I believe. So the first component of this is kind of ensuring that as we approach our needs and meeting our needs, that we in a sustainable approach we will attempt to accomplish our needs without compromising the ability of our children and their children afterwards to meet their needs. So it's I guess kind of like a net zero kind of approach to looking at resource consumption. And then the second component of sustainability, we talk here about the three pillars of which are kind of economic, environmental or social. And sometimes these are actually explicitly referred to as the three Ps, in which we would be talking about people, the planet, and profits. But they kind of align here to economic, environmental, and social. So that's kind of where we're coming from with sustainability. And thirdly, resiliency is something which there was certainly a flavour of in the last update to transaction, and this really speaks to the approach that the regional transportation system can continue to function in the face of one or more major or extreme events or obstacles to normal everyday function. And we've listed a few examples here, and I guess in a way I could look at the pandemic almost as a test of resiliency, not so much of the transportation system, but of the broadband communication systems that enable businesses and government agencies to function through the internet or through digital means as opposed to physical means. So that's kind of a form of resiliency. It's not exactly what we're talking about here, but it kind of gives you a sense of what we mean. So with that, if we go to the next slide, we have proposed vision and proposed goals, and we also show for completeness, although by no means comprehensiveness, some potential areas of objectives and measures which, as noted in parentheses, these are illustrative only. We don't envision any need to discuss these in any way at all, really, at this stage, for the reasons previously stated, that we're really looking under this action item for seeking the committee's recommendation or not on the proposed vision and goals. But we think it's appropriate and helpful to see how, if this set of vision and goals were to be the ones we move forward with, how potentially the objectives and measures might follow on behind that when we get to the point in the process, maybe a year from now, certainly more than 6 months from now, that's how it will kind of fit. So in the vision statement itself, you can see the words safe, equitable, sustainable, and resilience highlighted in yellow, essentially to draw attention to what I've just spoken about in terms of the new components. I did not speak about safety. Safety always has been a component of the authority's approach. It's actually enshrined in Virginia Code that we need to be cognizant of safety in what we do. But it's not previously been called out specifically in the vision statement, and for a couple of reasons, we thought this was a good opportunity, the right time to address that. And so really, when you look at that vision statement, there's kind of two pieces to it. The first two lines and then the subsequent three lines. So to take in the first two lines together, Northern Virginia will plan for and invest in a safe, equitable, sustainable and integrated multimodal transportation system. That's kind of like the big picture of what we want to do. And then we qualify that slightly by adding that this transportation system will enhance quality of life, strengthen the economy, and build resilience. And then what you see, the three proposed goals that follow, in turn, map into those three lines at the end of the proposed vision. So that is kind of our attempt to kind of tie the vision and the goals together. But obviously it's not as simple as that. I would say that the proposed goals 1 and 2 pretty much reflect themes that were in the previous vision and goals in particular. The third one that speaks to resiliency is new, and you don't, what you don't see there is the any use of the word equitable or indeed sustainable in those goals, and I'm going to kind of address that in just a moment, or safety for that matter. But they are in there in the vision, which will really be the guiding a kind of aspiration if approved by the authority. The authority essentially is setting the course for the next update to transaction. So if I could go to the next slide. I think I've only got a couple more slides here. Yeah, so I've got a couple of discussion slides that we'd like when I'm done, the committee to kind of focus on. And the first one here is kind of asking you how should the vision and goals be incorporated into the transportation analysis, and that's something that I can't really ask you without giving you some parameters, some guidance as to how to think about this. And so there are two approaches. There's the traditional approach that we've done previously, and it is effectively enshrined in law that we take a performance-based approach in what we do. But this is kind of the traditional, or at least now traditional, performance-based planning approach, where it's kind of very significantly quantitative in nature. Heavily model-based analysis, particularly for the mobility and accessibility measures, the first couple of measures in particular, and it gives us the ability to compare measures for underserved populations versus the general population, through a model-based approach. So the second approach here is what we've called core value approach. And so with this, it kind of moves away from the model-based analysis and instead turns to a more kind of holistic, overarching approach that is probably more top-down in nature. It could be more qualitative, although I do think it will be data-driven in many regards, but not necessarily through model-based analysis. And the core value approach would fit quite well for some. Safety has been a challenge for us in the past as to how you actually address safety in a long-range plan. So having safety as part of a core value approach as opposed to a performance-based approach offers some flexibility to actually look at safety, but not kind of constrain it into the performance-based approach that in this long-range plan is challenging, and that would also the core value approach would also be we consider a good way to look at equity and sustainability and kind of the whole question of integrated multimodal system anyway. So I kind of think of it visually, and I can't really do this very easily on the screen, but if you think of the three goals as kind of being like horizontal rows in a matrix, and be it 3 or 4 core value areas are kind of like more vertical oriented. It basically means we can kind of look at the core values as they apply across everything, not just a specific measure, a specific objective in a specific goal, but look at it much more broadly based than that. So that kind of conceptually is what I mean by core value. And as I show with my fingers, trying to do a 3x4 matrix, it's not an either or here. I think the performance-based approach and the core value approach are highly complementary, and they enable us flexibility to look at how well we deliver on the vision statement in ways that kind of lend themselves to the data and analytical tools that we're likely to have available to us. The final note on this discussion page is that whichever way we go, however we go forward, we will incorporate public engagement and stakeholder inputs before we actually get to the analytical stage of the work. And if we could just jump to the final slide, I want to come back to equity. I've talked about resilience and safety and sustainability, and I think we've got a reasonably good sense. That these are more tightly defined concepts. Equity to us is something which potentially means different things to different people, and as a result, we don't want to kind of lead you through this with our thoughts on how it should be done. I think it's important for Technical Advisory Committee and the 2 other committees I mentioned earlier to actually lead us in how we should focus on what are the kind of the equity issues that are pertinent to the region that should be considered in transaction. I'd say from the get-go, we shouldn't look upon transaction as the tool to solve all the inequities in Northern Virginia. In the same way that we don't look at transaction to resolve, or even all the transportation issues in Northern Virginia. I think that's unrealistic and setting ourselves up for failure. So it's more a question of what are the equity priority issues that we should be thinking about, and as we think about those, we then need to think about what process will be used to actually evaluate whether the transaction plan is even addressing those. That's kind of where we want the discussion to go. It's kind of a bit circular between process and priorities. But I'm happy to pause here and go back over any of the stuff that I've talked on. Otherwise, Chair Boyce, I kind of would hand it back to you for any initial reaction and to help us through the discussion. And if you feel comfortable, if the committee feels comfortable, ultimately to take action on the vision and goals. And if you don't feel comfortable, then that's fine too. This is not an ultra critical, time sensitive item, but we would like to, if we can, get a recommendation, consolidated recommendation from the committees to the authority by the end of the year. If it rolls over into early next year, that is not, it's not a catastrophe, but it would just enable us to move on to the next thing.
Fair enough.
Thank you.
Given the forum that we're in, we can't really be it's easier in a room. You can look at me and wave and say you want something, but in this forum, is there I don't think there's a raise hand function. I guess you would have to turn on your video and kind of wave your hand or whatever to start to speak, and I'll recognize you, and then we can have a discussion from there. I want to try to keep it an open discussion, but this forum doesn't allow for many people to talk at the same time. So let's try to keep it under control.
Actually, It looks like if you hover over your name in the participant list, it does have the raise hand function.
Oh, good. Good. Thanks, Armand. I do want to echo my old friend Doug Fall. He would always talk about that safety issue. And I think it hasn't shown up because of all the discussions that Doug and I had in the past. If it's not safe, we don't do it. So why should it be a measurement in in the approach? If it's not safe, it shouldn't be on the list. And that was always a not contentious, but it was always a discussion item that, yeah, we want to have safety as part of the thing, but if it's not safe, then it shouldn't even make the list of being considered. So I think in the past, we've said safety is part of the code of Virginia. It's already baked into the equation. So I kind of hesitate to add it as a measurement on anything, because everything is going to have, a 10 for safety, because why else would we be doing it? If it was a 1 on safety, it wouldn't be a thing. I see you shaking your head, Frank. But like the point there is, safety is part of all the projects that we're doing, and it is being addressed in the projects that have. It's addressed in why the projects come up. For the most part, there are safety issues that drive a lot of the projects. So I'm not saying don't measure it. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be stated. I am saying that making it a part of the matrix or the measurement, I'm not sure if that generates any value. I'll open the discussion. Frank was not shaking his head in disapproval. I'll let him speak.
Well, since that was on the topic, and I presume you can hear me this month, safety, I think, is relative. As you mentioned, 1 to 10. If we wanted to have a perfectly safe system, we'd have speed limits that were enforced to 5 miles an hour. And we don't do that. So, there can be a project, different levels of the project, some of which have greater safety than others, and that can be an evaluation measure. I want to go back because I was making quite a number of notes, or what may seem like quite a number of notes during Randy's presentation. One, and I mentioned this to Ray at the start, the vision statement reads like motherhood and apple pie. I don't see how anybody can object to it. It's great and includes everything. I did have a question on the goals. It wasn't clear to me whether the 3 goals that were listed are replacements to to the previous ones, or additions to. I wasn't clear whether they would replace the previous ones or they were just more goals that were added to the prior set. I'd like to get into a further discussion of the core values, though I think I can understand from Keith's discussion how he would intend to evaluate those. It's more of a kind of a yes, no, maybe, or some sort of subjective evaluation. And I think he's right that you need both performance-based and core value. And I was wondering whether those were applied as we go forward on a system level, or whether they are applied on a project by project level as part of the rating and ranking of individual projects. And then finally, on the equity, I think you have to look at something like the Title VI evaluations that are done for transit or environmental justice evaluations, presuming that in the next administration, those are still part of the number of things we have to look at for federal funding. So those are some questions and thoughts.
All right, thank you. You want to address that?
Yeah, Chairperson, I can certainly address the questions. And Frank, I appreciate your thoughts there. So in terms of the goals, what we were proposing would replace. They would not be additional. And essentially the reason for that is if we go with that vision statement, then we kind of need to realign the goals to kind of map more closely into that revised vision statement. This is kind of why we need to, we can't approve goals without the vision statement, but we can approve the vision statement without the goals. And if we can approve the vision statement with the goals, provided we don't change the vision statement and potentially undermine the goals. But easy answer to your question is these proposed goals would replace the goals, although there are similarities between them. In terms of how we would set about doing the evaluation, particularly with the core value approach, we would certainly do everything at the system level. That will be the starting point. The extent to which we can get down to the project level is challenging. We on the last cycle for transaction, we had 352 projects that made it through to the project list. We actually started with 700 projects, and we simply don't have the time, but in particular, we don't have the money to kind of do that level of project evaluation. But what we would like to do on this next iteration, and what we did to a certain extent on the previous, the current version of transaction, was to look down at the corridors and the corridor segments and look at packages of projects to see how they performed. But even then, we only really looked at the ones that were in there. We didn't really kind of do any comparative analyses, and I think this time it would be helpful if we were able to include that as well. But whether or not we can get down to the project level, it really just depends on how many projects end up being in transaction. But if it's anything like last time, that's not really going to be feasible. I think the rest of your comments were comments rather than questions, so I should wait until give other people a chance to speak.
I don't see anybody waving at me, but I did want to address. Oh, Amy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a comment at the, I kind of agree with Frank. I thought the vision statement there was nothing objectionable about it, but Chairman, you made a good point about the safety. However, I'm looking at the current goals, and goal number 2 has improved the safety of the transportation network. So I don't know how that fits in with not including safe in part of the vision statement. Just a thought.
I wasn't saying it couldn't be part of the vision statement, but it's in the past, and I have the benefit of having multiple years on the committee. In the past, this safety was offered up as a measurement for ranking the projects that were involved. And the conversation always turned to, why are we even ranking safety? If it's safe or it's not. If it's not, don't do it. Therefore, everything's going to be safe on the list, and it doesn't help you identify which one should have priority or have a higher ranking or whatnot. So that's where that conversation is going. Not to take it out of the vision statement. Not at all. That should be part of the vision and purpose of what we're doing. I was speaking mainly on the approach and how to run projects. Anything to that, Amy?
No, thank you. That was a good clarification. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Chair Boyce, I see that Karen also had raised her hand.
Yes, I see her waving too. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess I have more of a clarification and a statement rather than a question, but I just want to make sure I understand how all of these pieces fit in. We have that vision, the proposed vision, which I think is great. I really like the approach on defining it, but then also, having some kind of quantifier in terms of showing just how transformative transportation is to the advancement and the betterment of our community. It's not just mobility, but it deals with quality of life and economy. So I just really like that emphasis in the vision plan, and have it right there front and center with everything. But we have the proposed goals and objectives, and then there is the approach in which there is, and this is where I'm kind of getting a little shaky in my understanding. Is it that right now we're at a crossroads where we're trying to figure out whether or not our the approach is going to be a performance-based, a core value approach, or there's a possibility that it could be a hybrid. So that needs to be a decision made at some point moving forward, either before the end of this year or first part of next year.
Chair Boyce, if I may answer the question. Thanks. And I apologise. This is confusing. We're introducing these concepts for the first time. We've not previously adopted a core value approach. We've only really had the performance-based approach, and that did lead to proliferation's perhaps not the right word, but we because there were so many things that all the committees and others wanted to include, we ended up ultimately with 15 measures. At the same time, constantly getting the advice that 15 measures is too many. How do you reduce it? Basically we couldn't on the last go around. So that was kind of like a pragmatic challenge that we kind of faced last time, and we wanted to address this time. So at this stage, I'm really just trying to kind of get the committee to kind of feel comfortable that a performance-based approach, the traditional approach, will remain, but we'd like your initial reaction, you're not going to vote on it, is to having this kind of like not two tiers, but these kind of two approaches that are complementary, the performance-based and the core value approach, where the core value approach would be applied more for the things like safety, which for the reasons that Chair Boyce has outlined has always been challenging within the context of transaction, because as he points out, the authority is not going to invest money in projects that are inherently unsafe, and no jurisdictional agency is going to build any that are unsafe, certainly not intentionally. If it's kind of like a given, but here's a thought, if it helps, if we include safety as part of the core value approach instead of the performance-based approach that we've done before. And I think Amy pointed out one of the objectives to speak to safety, and that was the compromise we made on the last go round. But instead of doing that, if we look at safety as a core value, which kind of speaks to this kind of top-down approach across everything, one of the ways we could potentially do that is use a metric that VDOT uses. I'm not sure VDOT is the brains trust behind this, or whether this is from a federal source, but they have something which they call an equivalent property damage only index. Essentially what they do is they look at all the crashes across the Commonwealth, and they kind of give them a numerical score where, if it's a property damage only crash, it gets a score of 1. And then if it's more severe and there's kind of like fatal injuries, fatalities associated with it, then the score it would get would maybe like up to 100. And then what you can do is look at clusters of crashes and kind of come up with this equivalent property damage only index for a cluster, for whatever geographic zone you want to draw on GIS, basically. And so a core value approach might be, and it's just a possibility, I'm not saying this is what we're going to do because we're only at the early stages of thinking about it ourselves, but a core value approach might be that we look at that data, which is readily available data. It's produced now, and kind of look across the region and get an understanding of maybe where there are some hot zones for crashes, and even understanding a bit more why, if there's any kind of common themes with those crashes, and essentially use that kind of core value approach almost as something that would be setting needs at the front end as opposed to evaluating projects at the back end of the process. So it's just a possibility. Haven't thought that through yet. There may be other ways we could do this. We certainly would look to see what other planning bodies like us do on this. But I'll leave you one thought that it has really stuck with me from NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Agency. They've said at numerous occasions with respect to autonomous vehicles, self-driving vehicles, that something in excess of 90% of crashes are as a consequence of some form of human error. Okay, so it's especially challenging to try and look at solutions where there may be a randomized nature in why they happen and where they happen anyway. So that's something we kind of need to keep in mind. So, I mean, I don't know where we're going to go with it right now, but I agree with those of you who said that including it in the vision statement, it's motherhood and apple pie, and it is a philosophy that we think is appropriate in the vision statement, but it gives us flexibility as to how we actually do it. For now, we don't need to make that decision for many, many months.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Well, there are other hands up. I'm not able to see when the hands go up. Go ahead, Frank.
I just wanted to add a thought on the safety. It strikes me that when you get down to project evaluation, a project, should be included because a project that ameliorates an existing condition that to improve the safety, for example, let's say a bike bridge over Route 29 might get raised up higher because it is a substantial safety improvement. So it's something that, really should be included in some level, as opposed to a project that, might just improve mobility, but might not necessarily improve safety.
Sure, and if I may, the other concept that we're aware of, and we're not quite sure whether it's directly relevant, but we are doing a bit of research on this now, is the Vision Zero concept of within a certain time frame, maybe 10 years, a jurisdictional agency would strive to eliminate fatalities on whatever piece of the transportation system they have jurisdiction over. Within Northern Virginia, Alexandria has gone down this route. I think Arlington is kind of moving that way. VDOT has kind of something similar. The district has been doing it probably for the longest. And I've got to be honest, those Vision Zero programs are great if you can make them happen, but they're incredibly challenging and require some really tough choices. You can't just adopt a Vision Zero policy and it will happen, right? You've actually got to work really hard to make a Vision Zero policy actually become and achieve the goals that you set for it, which are inherent in the title of it. But that's something that we can certainly look at as well, at least in terms of understanding where our member jurisdictions are going in the Vision Zero world over the next 5 or 10 years. And obviously, it would make sense that we embrace that in what we do. But since at the end of the day, we are a planning and funding body, we're not the implementation or operational body. The ability of MBTA to influence safety is always going to be constrained by that fact.
Chair Boyce, I see Armand has raised his hand.
Go ahead, Armand.
So Keith, just to follow up. So we're talking about wholesale replacing the existing goals with the proposed goals, but potentially, I mean, that's one potential outcome here, or is there a potential for placing one or two, or is it binary? Is it a 0 or a 1? Is it all of them or none of them, or is it somewhere in between?
The proposed vision and the proposed goals are a package. What's being proposed would replace what currently exists, both in terms of the vision and the goals. Okay,
just making sure. And then the objectives. I mean, I notice here again, it says it's an illustrative outline, so I'll take that as it is. And you got 8 here as opposed to the 15 that we currently have. As far as different performance measures, assuming we had measures that we're going from, but if we were to go down that path, 8 versus 15, how do we, assuming we were to stay on a performance-based approach, how do we make sure that, because I mean, I always said 15 was too many. I mean, how do we keep it at 8? How do we reduce the number of measures? Has there been discussion about how we don't let that grow to be 15 again? This is half, which I think is good. I mean, I'm just curious as to whether if we were to stay in a performance-based approach, how we can keep the number of measures down.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's seared into my brain how many times you've told us that 15 is too many, and I appreciate you saying 8 is better, although I get the sense you'd rather have fewer than 8. I think how we accomplish that is going to be an exercise in self-restraint, probably. We've had some discussions earlier in the year with jurisdiction and agency staff, just to kind of do some of the groundwork on our thinking on this, and an approach that worked well with the staff at least is we're going to have 8. So if you want to add one in, what are you going to take out? And you kind of, in the end, you kind of begin to go through a prioritization process. Now, as I said, we're not looking for any action on objectives and measures right now because it's premature. But that's the sort of thing that when we get to the right time, we might start saying, how do you prioritize these? What do we absolutely have to have, and what can we live without? Obviously, until vision and goals are established, that whole conversation is moot anyway. So that's kind of my perhaps naive thinking about how if we say 8, then how will we stick to 8? But I have to say the exercise that we did with jurisdiction and agency staff, they did understand and respond accordingly, and I think everyone accepted that when you get down to 8, then you can weight some of those measures at more than 5 or 10%, which is kind of where we are at the moment. I would say that you see that the very bottom of this slide here in the proposed resilience goal, that there's one measure which is associated with surge capacity / homeland security. The homeland security piece of this is something that is actually enshrined in law, and that's the piece of Virginia Code we refer to as HB 599. From the 2012 session, which requires significant transportation projects in Northern Virginia to go through a process that's outlined in that legislation. It's very high level, and it talks about using measures that address you don't quote me exactly on the words, but accessibility, mobility, and homeland security. And so while a measure was never specified for any of those kind of measure topics, as it were, the fact that homeland security is written in the law means we have to have something that addresses, the intent of including the words homeland security in that piece of the code. And the way we've dealt with that traditionally, which actually ties in extremely well with resiliency as we think about it, is, how will the network perform if we have some reason to need surge, if there's a surge on the network? How would the system perform? And you can begin to look at different approaches, different types of projects, and see which ones would cope best with different sorts of surges. So I think what we would be looking to do here under resiliency is to keep the homeland security piece, but expand it to look at other forms of extreme event for which resiliency might be a need to see how the system performs. Homeland security, I think the thought always was that what's going to happen is everyone's going to drive out of DC during the afternoon rush hour or something. Obviously, usually the advice is shelter in place and not swamp the system. But that aside, that was the intent behind that measure, and I think it gives us a basis for looking at resiliency without actually adding a measure. We just look to do that in a different way. Something else also related to the HB 599 legislation is, and we did show this, although you need really good eyesight to see it on the slide that shows the existing vision and goals. There are 7 measures which are asterisked to denote that they were the measures that were included as part of the HB 599 analysis. Thank you. So if you look under the performance measure column, the very top one there is total person hours of delay. You see an asterisk next to that, and at the bottom of that table, the note is measure included in HB 599 rating process. So there are actually about 4 or 5 measures which are kind of related to congestion reduction, and then kind of slice and dice it in different ways. So one of the ways we've been able to get down to 8 measures is, since the measures themselves are not enshrined in HB 599, to kind of consolidate the congestion measures, probably building around actually total person hours of delay, because that is a measure we use not just in transaction, but also we use in our 6-year programming analysis, and also the Commonwealth uses as part of Smart Scale. So we might be able to, we will be able to reduce the number of congestion-related measures from 5 to something much lower than that. So that's kind of giving us the bandwidth to accomplish the reduction and potentially, revise, even add some measures. So it's a long answer, but that's the thinking that's behind it.
Okay, thanks. That was a lot of information, a lot to think about.
More than you expected, Armand?
Keith's always a font of information.
He is. I think the question was the performance-based approach has a question mark next to it. There are 2 bullets. And the compare measures for underserved population versus general population. Is that a question between those 2 bullets, which way to go? Keith?
Sorry, could Ria advance the slides to slide 6? I think that was the one you're referring to.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was talking slide 6.
Okay.
It's in the discussion elements.
Yeah.
That one.
Yeah. Okay.
Is it a question between those 2 bullets, or are we saying that we're going to start comparing measures for the underserved population? I'm pretty sure we're doing we've been doing the first bullet. I think that's what you said.
Right. Yeah. No. Good point. I think that question mark after performance-based approach shouldn't actually be there.
Okay.
But yeah, in terms of how we would look at it, and this is kind of speaking particularly to the equity aspects. Is if depending on how depending on how the equity priorities are defined. We won't know exactly how we're going to do this without that. But a way we could do that under the performance-based approach is by comparing, whether it's 8 or 15, hopefully 8 measures. We could look to see how different populations are kind of affected by different projects. That's the kind of conceptual approach that we have in mind under a performance-based approach to look at equity. Obviously, we'd need an equity measure though in order to be able to do that, which is why looking at equity as part of a core value approach as well has got some offers an alternative way to look at equity. But if we were to do equity under performance-based approach, that was our initial thought as to how it could be done. So it's just really given as an example.
Right. I'm looking at that, and I'm trying to figure out how now and in the future would we figure out what's an underserved population, and how do we define that? I think that might get us into some trouble. See where I'm going with that.
Yeah. I can give you an initial sense as to how we would maybe start to think about looking at it. TPB has developed a good tool that looks at and a good approach that looks at what they're characterizing as equity emphasis areas within the region. So a lot of the groundwork for this has already been done. So I think what we would try to do, and this would work well under the core value approach, is to kind of use TPB's equity emphasis areas tool to kind of at least identify, in a manner that's consistent with what TPB does, where we might have an equity issue, and then we can begin to look at whether we even have projects that address those equity emphasis desires, and if they do, how they perform. So again, this is very very embryonic thinking at the moment. We're not there yet, but I believe there are tools and data sources available to us that would support a core value approach. So it wouldn't be entirely kind of like a subjective exercise. I think there would be fairly good elements of it being, qualitative data driven, but just not the traditional model approach that we use.
I guess I'm concerned about not using the model-based approach. That's a proven approach since we began transportation. Me personally, I'll let the committee speak for themselves, but I think we start throwing in terms of underserved, you start getting into how do you define that? I can argue that my neighborhood's underserved because I don't have access to a major road right from my house. I need to have immediate access to I-35. It's preposterous. I certainly wouldn't want that, but the neighborhood that I'm in is not served by a mass transit. Am I underserved? In my personal definition, I would not say so, but how do you get away from somebody claiming that?
Yeah.
I think it's just, you're introducing some trouble. I see Frank is trying to wave me down, so I'll get this one.
I don't know if you've ever done an FTA Title VI evaluation. I think underserved might not be the right word. I mean, it really is addressing minority populations or historically disadvantaged populations. And I can see how you could run like the analysis of jobs accessible within 45 minutes by transit or whatever, or 45 minutes by driving for minority populations versus the general population is the kind of quantitative analysis you could do. Not saying it would be all that meaningful, but I mean, it's the type of thing that could be done to address the equity issue. And FTA has, Title VI analyses for major transit changes, and they're done all the time. And I don't know what the COG process is, but my guess is, Keith, you might be able to expand on this, that the COG process is something along those same lines.
But before you go, Keith, that process is already in place. I don't think we want MBTA to do that process again. So I understand that Title VI, even in the NEPA documentation for projects, there's the social justice criteria that it's gone through. I don't think the MBTA needs to start taking that, redoing that wheel if it's already being done by the localities or the agencies that are proposing the projects. I guess we could say that it hasn't been looked at, but that enters into the documentation that's put in for the projects.
So I guess if it's already being done by the jurisdictions, it would be a simple matter to incorporate it into our evaluations.
Yeah, and what I'm saying is that is already part of the equation.
That's fine. But then let's, rather than saying we're not doing it, say we do it by incorporating the work that has already been done by others.
Yeah, I grant that, but I guess I was trying to steer us away from saying, hey, MBTA, look at the measure of underserved population versus general and add that as a criteria rather than the established criteria that we already have developed over the past, where it's been 8 years now, doing the prioritization projects, or prioritizing the projects or grading them.
Was equity a factor then? Was equity considered?
It was not overtly stated as it is now. And I'm not arguing that we can't. I'm not arguing that we can't bring that out to the fore. But I also don't want to. Personally, I don't want to have the MBTA start doing yet another thing that somebody else has already done. They're not repeating a process, which takes all efficiency out of the equation.
No, I don't think you should redo work that was already done. But I'm getting the sense that perhaps the governing bodies would like equity to have a higher profile in the evaluation discussion. And if we can do that simply by incorporating work that's been done by others, that's the best of all possible worlds.
I think we agree on that. But Keith, go ahead. I thought you were going to say something.
No, this is great conversation. I'm not going to kind of weigh in one way or another. At this stage, we don't actually need to. But I think you're raising issues that we need to look at before we make it. Before we make a recommendation to you and you make a recommendation to the authority. But this is going to tie back more into how we address the measures, how we deal with performance-based planning alongside the core value approach. It doesn't influence any action you may choose to take on the vision and goals. I do believe we've got time and flexibility to figure out the process we want to follow. I'm with both of you on not wanting to reinvent any wheels or redo something that's already been done. The Title VI is the obvious one to look at, which anyone who's receiving federal dollars, I think probably has to do, which is why all the MPOs do it. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but we're not required to do it to follow any particular federal regulation. But it's more a question of what's the right thing to do, and really for me and our team and the consultant is going to be, well, what specific equity priority issues do we want to address? I think and until we've really looked at that, I think it's probably a bit moot to talk about how we'll do it.
Karen, you were waving.
Yes, I'll just make my comment really brief, particularly after Keith mentioned that we're pretty early in the process to really say whether an element should be removed or if we should move forward with it. But I just wanted to stress that as part of the funding process, that even though NVTA is funding and we have limited influence on the different jurisdictions, the actual fact of funding is a huge influential piece that can help to mold the behavior of how we want our regional transportation system to be built. And part of that is looking at the underserved population. Part of that is looking at places within our region that does not have adequate transportation system. And that is, and part of that is also making sure that we're not dispersing funds to areas that already have a pretty decent and or adequate transportation system, but making sure those marginalized and areas that have not received the funding to be able to be competitive. So I just wanted to stress those very important pieces in consideration that should not be lost in technicality. And I look forward to seeing what the staff presents as we move forward. I also wanted to ask, in the previous, or no, actually, we're still in 2020. During 2020, there were some environmental justice bills that were passed, including the Environmental Justice Act. So the Commonwealth is actually starting to define what environmental justice communities are, and are looking at ways in which they would define what underserved population. So there's some stuff that we might be able to not only look at what other agencies are doing, such as FTA, but also look at the direction in which the Commonwealth is actually moving towards, as well as the Environmental Justice Advisory Council that will be coming out with additional recommendations for various elements within the Commonwealth, including transportation.
Very good. Don't disagree with any of that. Keith, you have something?
Actually, I'll defer to Monica, if I may.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I would just like to follow up on Karen's comment. The Commonwealth, actually, they're in the process of updating their long-range transportation plan, which is called VTrans. So I will follow up with them to see if they're including, some of these environmental justice legislations and how are they accounting for it in VTrans, because it could be something that we learn from as well. Having said that, and I don't want to get too far in the agenda, we are actually supposed to get a VTrans update at the November 12th authority meeting because I think they're out for public comment. So Karen, thank you for that. We can look and see what the Commonwealth is doing and if they're incorporating anything in their long range transportation plan update.
Anyone else want to weigh in? Karen, you want to say anything?
I was just going to say thank you, but I was having problems with my mute button.
Fair enough. Armand, you're muted.
So just to kind of, I don't want to reiterate what you said earlier, Randy, but just, going after all the time we spent working on the performance-based approach, I have concerns about switching from a quantitative approach to a qualitative approach. And like I said, Keith has said early in the process, I just want to, and I think we all agree that we just need to really fully understand what that means before we move in that direction. That's all. I mean, it's possible it will be and it would work and maybe perhaps work better, but just we need to really understand what that is and how it would be run, prior to moving forward. And it sounds like that's going to happen. It's just wanted to reiterate just the need for that to occur. That's all.
I fully agree. Monica, go ahead.
My apologies, I'm a little slow on the mute. And I do want to know, it's going to be impossible really to totally do away with, if that's the direction. We will have a quantitative approach with modeling, because when we get to the funding, we have to use a computer simulated model. That is in the law. That is a must. So I don't want anyone to think that that is the direction, because the funding or HB 599 is actually the bill that it was incorporated in, states that we have to use a computer simulated software.
Yes, that's a good point. I don't know if we have, you had mentioned you wanted a feedback or some kind of motion. Keith, how do we want to, what's the end goal here?
Yes, thank you. Item 4 on your agenda is an action item, and staff recommendation is approval of the vision and goals that would then advance to the authority for subsequent action. If you feel comfortable that we are giving you the appropriate assurance that no decision is going to be made on objectives and measures and kind of more explanation of how we would weave together a performance-based approach with a core value approach, without further opportunity to discuss. I mean, I strongly, as I can give you my assurance that that's what will happen. We're many months away from that point, but having some certainty on the vision and the goals as early as you feel comfortable will be helpful. It just takes out one degree of uncertainty for us.
So slide 5 is the proposed vision and goals. We didn't really talk about that because we got into the weeds after that. Does anybody take exception? I see you, Frank. Give me a minute. We can talk about the vision and goals, or we can say we buy into what is being proposed and move forward. I just pose that as a question. We'll let Frank talk, and then we'll address it.
Yeah, I would have no problem, with the vision. We really didn't talk about the goals, and I didn't. It said they were proposed, so I didn't really realize we were going to be asked to confirm those tonight. And would want to. I would be happier spending more time thinking and talking about the goals in a little more detail before voting on them. But the vision, absolutely. I think that's great.
That's fair. Is there, the goals haven't changed much from what I remember from the past. What do you have to, do you have any discussion points that you want to address on that first? That's an open question to the committee. Right.
Well, on goal 1, I think enhancing the quality of life is great, but I'm not sure improving mobility is the only way to do that, or whether in a goal statement it should have that much emphasis. And as number 3, I think we want to enhance the operational performance under all conditions, not just under extreme conditions. So I think the statements could use a little bit of fine tuning.
I can give you some context on that, and Keith, pipe in if I'm off. 1 is directly relating back to the House bills that generated our committee. and the funding mechanism, the focus was improving the mobility and reducing congestion. So that's where that goal really came from. Number 3 is addressing the emergency preparedness evacuation of the metro DC area and enhancing that performance as a multimodal system under unusual, that would be 9/11 type emergency evacuations. That's where that goal is coming from. Without that context, I can see where it'd be like, well, gee whiz, but that's the context of where those goals originally came from. And it's addressing the house bills. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, then number 1 would be just as good if we simply said improve the mobility of Northern Virginians, who don't have to have the enhanced quality of life part in it. And number 3 doesn't necessarily have to be limited. Yes, we want to do that, but we want to provide a system that is, resilient for all sorts of reasons.
Monica?
And thank you, Chair Boyson, and this is a very fruitful discussion. I will just note for number 1, and remember the authority is primarily comprised of elected officials, even though not all of them are elected officials. When we talk about reducing congestion, there is a direct correlation to the improvement of quality of life from their standpoint. When they are speaking at these events, they talk about how some people are charged late fees because they can't get to their children in time. They can't get to these games and other things because they're stuck in traffic. And it's interesting because, and not even with the authority, but statewide and talking with the secretary's office, you get the correlation between improving mobility, reducing congestion, and what that means for the quality of life. You get more time out of your vehicles and commuting, or less time in your vehicles and commuting, and more time with your families or doing other things. So I did want to note that's where that came from. And it can definitely be a recommendation of the committee to change that, but I don't want you to be surprised if it's there at the end.
Any other discussion? Armand? Amy, I'm sorry.
Well, I'll just back up the enhance the quality of life. And certainly one of the elements there was increasing the walkable communities and pedestrian and bicycles. And I think that's typically thought of in that enhancement of quality of life. So I don't really see that. I personally don't have a problem with that part. And the number 3 with I guess I just a comment overall that those proposed new elements of equity, sustainability, and resiliency, I felt like those are very topical and those are very good elements to add to this. And I think I just wanted to back up Karen's points on, on equity. If we're really going to introduce that as a new element, then we need to be prepared to really put teeth into that. And make sure that that's truly a priority.
So are you saying that to add equitable, or break out your thesaurus, whatever equity is, add that to number 3, or add that to the goals in general?
I think it's important to have a measure for it. Yes, I do think that.
So I could just to clarify that adding an equity measure is that what you're saying, Amy?
It is. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Armand was waving me down.
So I guess that's kind of my question. I had a similar question. So the proposed new elements, how do they fit in with you? I mean, that's what's a little unclear to me still, and I apologize if I'm being dense here. I guess how do these new, for example, equity, where does equity fit in the proposed goals? Is it part of number 1? Is it a is it a kind of a vision? Is it an idea, a concept that's supposed to be incorporated into number one? I mean, what I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out. How do we consider that?
Thanks, Simone, and Amy as well. So, like I say, I said earlier, I wanted to avoid kind of getting into the details of the measures yet. And I mean, we don't want the goals to just be simply kind of a reordering of the words in the vision statement. So if the reference to equity, is in the vision statement, then what that means is we will kind of, however we do it, we'll be looking at each of these three goals from an equity perspective. So that's kind of one of the advantages of the core value approach is applying it to everything and not just to something. The other thing I would say is, we went back and looked at the measures from the currently approved transaction, and I think there are probably potentially half a dozen of those measures, if they made it through to this update, have some equity component to them, and particularly the one I think Frank referred to earlier, and I think it's come up a couple of times. Access to jobs, through the transportation system, including specifically calling it out by auto and by transit, was previously a measure. So that would fit very comfortably in goal number 2, and that actually could be the home for an equity measure if we wanted to put one in there versus going down the core value approach. So I think there's flexibility to put equity in at multiple places without necessarily putting the words into the goal itself. And I think my preference would be to have the flexibility to kind of apply it in multiple places rather than force it into one place. I realise that may leave you feeling uncertain that we would deliver on that commitment.
It's just that this is, like you said, I mean, it's been reiterated. We're early on. There's a lot to figure out still. I mean, because it's so early on, we were being asked to kind of say yes or no about something that decisions are still going to be made about later on when we get into the nitty gritty of it. So that's all.
So what we can say is that in general, we are in agreement with the concept, or words to that effect. Not necessarily say, yep, we're good with all this. We're okay with the concept of, based on the conversations we've had today, based on the conversations we're going to have with other committees, this is going to formulate into something that we're going to be able to put a check mark on probably next month or the month after.
Sure, Chair Boyce, if I may, one approach to possibly consider here. I'm not really hearing any dissent at all to the vision statement. So possibly, you may want to offer to the committee the option to support you take action to support the vision statement and maybe more of a nuanced or qualifying support for the goals, subject to revisiting, so as you say, over the next month or two. But if you at least feel the vision is solid, then even supporting that would help us.
So to the committee, can we make a statement from the committee that we are in support of the proposed vision as it is stated here? Not necessarily a motion. I think just a mention of support of it, unless you're looking for a motion, Keith, and we can talk about that.
I personally don't think it necessarily has to be that. I mean, if you want to make a statement, I mean, that's helpful because we can move forward with that.
What I'm thinking is in the meeting or not the meeting minutes, but the notes to the authority that come out of these meetings that I approve after the meetings, that would have that we accepted, or I'll use the word approve because it's in my head, but we approved the vision statement as it is stated here. Not necessarily a motion, but we what is the word I'm trying to find? Accepted it. No exceptions taken, or some wording of that effect. Help me out here, Amy. You know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can help you say it though.
Support.
Is there? I'm sorry.
Support. Endorse.
Support. Support's a good word. We are in general support of the proposed vision statement. Is that something we can all kind of nod our head at and agree to? Thumbs up. We'll go with a thumbs up this time.
Yep.
Good. Armand, you flashed faster than I could look at you. I'm sorry. Was that a thumbs up?
I don't see I don't know. Is there a little? I don't know something.
No, we're just going with it. Okay.
Okay. Pat says thumbs up.
Thank you. we can go with that in the meeting notes to the authority. The goals, it sounds like those are a work in progress. Would that be an accurate statement, Keith or Monica?
That's reasonable. Yeah. I mean, I think maybe not committing to the goals to the same level of as supporting the vision is helpful, because when we have this conversation with the PCAC and the PPC committees over the next couple of weeks, we might get similar or different feedback, and then when we next discuss this with the TAC, we'll be able to share their reactions back to you, and that might help further inform the conversation.
So my reading of the tea leaves here is that we're in general support of it. However, we think that they could be probably massaged a bit, because as you look at it, the vision as it was stated before we added the yellow, integrated multimodal transportation system, that is in the basically 1 and 3. That enhances quality of life, that's in 1. Strengthens the economy, that's in 2. And builds whatever the word was before. I think it was a resilient, not a resilient, but something about the strength of the multimodal system for extreme circumstances, which was that's going off of my memory, which is bad. The goals as they are now don't include the new words, so I think that's where we're getting a little hung up, especially if we're trying to enhance the equity stuff, components. That I agree with you, Keith. That probably fits right into 2. You could probably change that to say this: strengthen the region's economy by increasing and enhancing equitable access to jobs and employees. Increasing and enhancing equity. I think if you threw that in there, probably whiz bang right through here. So the statement to the authority, and thumbs up again, we're in general support of the goals, but we are awaiting the feedback from the other committees after they hear our feedback, and they can consider their own feedback. Try to put that in 10 words or less. And we can wordsmith that. Armand?
So effectively, what you're saying is, as concerns the vision and the goals, in principle, we don't have any objections to what they say. However, we're withholding, please move forward with these until we hear back from what the other committees are thinking, if they have any input, and what, the actual objectives and measures are, and whether or not we're planning to move forward with a core value or performance-based approach. Kind of until all those details get worked out, we're going to withhold, or we will maintain the ability to come back and make further suggestions based on what comes out as we move down the line. But at least at the moment, we have no objections to what these things say. Is that correct?
Yes. We'll try to summarize that into I liked how you opened it, but what I'll do is once I get things, I can send things around just to make sure that everybody's in concurrence through email. That would not constitute a meeting. It's just a clarification of what we have already discussed. So we wouldn't be breaking meeting laws by going through email. And Keith and Bria and Monica can keep me honest on that one. And Sheree. Does that get you what you need to move forward? I hope.
That's very, very helpful. We don't want you. We don't want to force you to move faster than you feel comfortable moving. I appreciate the feedback. I appreciate the kind of support in principle for the vision and the goals, and recognize that you'd like to see a bit more information before completely committing to the goals. But I'm also hearing that the vision statement is that there's not really any exception taken to that, so that's a bit more solid.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other discussion on this before we move to Monica and then close? We're way beyond my 59-minute rule. Monica, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be quick. As I noted previously, we anticipate getting an update on the VTrans process and where the Commonwealth is on that, which is their long-range transportation plan. And it really provides the nexus for some of the smart scale funding. So we will get that update at the November 12th authority meeting. In addition to that presentation, I anticipate that we will get an update on the I-495 next project. I do want to note, it appears that the General Assembly session has ended. At this time, we're being told that the governor is waiting for the election or until after the election to sign anything. So the budget primarily, so that's where we are on that, but there was no diversion or anything of authority revenue. So we are still intact from that standpoint. In our legislative program, we are seeking, full restoration from the revenues that were diverted to Metro 2 years ago. So, Mr. Chair, that's all I have.
All right, thank you. Open floor for anybody to make any statements or make a motion to adjourn. No statements. Somebody make a motion to Amy.
Motion to adjourn.
All right, come on. Second. All right. Anybody say no? I'll kill you. We're adjourned. Strike that from the minutes, please. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Have a good evening.
Hi.
Thanks, everyone.